Hi students, this week we are discussing Plato's Apology from your 5 Dialogues textbook. Plato is the author and his teacher Socrates is the main speaker in this particular dialogue. And using the word teacher to describe Socrates, teacher is a little bit of a strong word because he didn't have any specific teachings. He claimed not to really know anything, and he didn't really have a school or students per se. Instead, Socrates was an old man who was wandering around Athens asking people questions. That's what he did to practice philosophy. And so when we think about what a philosopher is, especially a historically important philosopher like Socrates, we frequently kind of put them up on a pedestal and idealize them, right? So this statue of Socrates makes him look so wise, so beautiful, so awe-inspiring. But during Socrates' lifetime, he was not taken seriously at all. He was kind of come across like kind of a bum. He was wandering around in a dirty toga. He didn't care about money. He didn't care about status. And he didn't care about what other people thought about him. Instead, he was just really passionate about having these philosophical conversations. And we have records of these conversations because he attracted the attention of a lot of young Athenian men. Men like Plato and Xenophon wrote down some of these conversations. So we have a historical record of the fact that he existed and he had these conversations. But otherwise, he would have been someone who we would have no record of and have no idea who he was. So it's interesting that this is a figure that's considered really important in our time and kind of put up on a pedestal, but we have to keep in mind during his own lifetime, he was not respected. And if you read a lot of the dialogues, not the ones assigned in this class, you see other people making fun of him for not caring about things that they think he should care about, like money and status and dressing well and taking pleasure in sort of the things that material life can give you. So the apology is his sort of legal defense in a trial. That's the word, how the word apology is being used here. Covers the sort of trial of Socrates. We get a sense of how other Athenians thought about Socrates in this particular trial. So Meletus and these other accusers bring Socrates to the court, and they accuse him of rejecting the gods of the city, which would be considered impiety, and corrupting the youth, which was considered something he did as a sophist, which I'll explain in a moment. Both of these things were considered dangerous to the sort of city because it was questioning the sort of rules and moral fabric by which the city operated. And so these were punishable by death. So what is sophistry? That seems like a strange word. Sometimes sophistry is translated as oratory, but essentially, if we think about what ancient Greece was like, it was a democracy, which meant it was ruled by the people, or it was more specifically ruled by the citizens, and that meant land-owning men who were born there. So foreigners were not considered citizens, women were not citizens, and slaves were not citizens. So only about 30% of the population actually got to participate in what they called democracy. But essentially, you would have to be able to convince an entire crowd of people that the sort of military action you wanted to take was the correct one, or that they should put your law into force, or if you're in the courtroom, you wouldn't just have a small jury, you would have a jury of hundreds of people. And so you needed to be able to convince people you were right. And so this is where sophists come in. These were men who would say that they could give you the power to make the weaker argument the stronger. No matter how bad your argument is, they can make it strong so you can win in the court and you can win when you're speaking to large crowds of people. And this gives you an enormous amount of power in a democracy because you can get a lot of people on your side. So sophists would charge a lot of money to teach ambitious young men how to be sophists like them. So essentially what they're trying to do is just take money and give people power. That's what a sophist was. So you can see how this would be kind of a corrupting force in Athens. In fact, sophists did create a lot of instability in the politics of the city. So sophistry and philosophy are not the same thing, but the Athenians thought that Socrates as a philosopher was not a philosopher, but a sophist. So Socrates spends some time at the beginning of the Apology saying that they told you, I'm going to speak beautifully, but I don't know how to do that. I'm going to speak plainly, the way that I speak when I'm in the marketplace. And so essentially what sophists do is they create really beautiful arguments with rhetoric that's so convincing that you're not really looking to see if they have any reasoning behind it or any evidence behind it. So for a sophist, the goal of an argument is to win, and to win by any means possible. One of the other things sophists do is present their argument so confidently that you just seem like you know what you're talking about, even if you don't. And so sophists would argue that you don't need to have knowledge, you just need to present your argument as though you do. And then they also really didn't believe in ethics. And so it's okay to beat your opponent in any way possible, even if you're using wrong information, even if you're just attacking their character and you're not really presenting a real argument. Any of those kind of dirty moves are considered okay if you're a sophist. And if we look at what sophists did in the way they would present their arguments to people to convince them and get them on their side, they often were engaging with emotions and popular opinion, trying to get everybody on a bandwagon, and they were not so much interested in reasoning or evidence or providing the truth. So that's what a sophist was like. A philosopher is different. So for a philosopher, the goal of having a conversation isn't to win it. The goal of having a conversation is to really investigate ideas, think about them more deeply. And so that means that you have to define terms and explain what you mean. You have to examine your sort of assumptions about a particular idea. You have to provide evidence for what you're saying, and you have to reason through it. You have to kind of show why you think the way you do. And that means drawing new connections and coming to new realizations about what you think. But the main thing that philosophers are doing is they're engaging with ideas. We saw this in the allegory of the cave, that we're trying to get beyond opinions and appearances and the way things seem, and we're trying to get to how things really are when we think about them deeply and engage with ideas. So the other part of this speech that Socrates gives is he explains this oracle about him. So he explains why he's not a sophist, and I give you some more information about what a sophist is. And we also see him giving this story about why he became unpopular in Athens. So he's like, everyone hates me. It's not because I'm corrupting the youth. Let me tell you why everyone hates me. It started with this oracle from Delphi. So Delphi is a city in Greece, and it's about 100 miles away from the city of Athens. So you can drive there, and you can actually visit these cities today. You can see the ruins of this Apollo, this temple to Apollo in Delphi. So the temple of Apollo is where there was an oracle, the Delphi oracle, and she was a high priestess and prophet. So the Delphi oracle was a woman. She would sit in this temple, and there were these sort of vapors coming up out of the ground that she was, now we know she was probably getting high off of the vapors, and that's why she was saying some interesting things. But at the time they thought, you know, she was possessed by the gods. The gods were speaking directly to her in this holy place. And so you're receiving messages from the gods. And a lot of times she spoke in riddles, which meant you had to interpret what she said. You couldn't just take it at face value, you had to kind of figure it out. And that's why Socrates says that the Delphi oracle presents this riddle where she says that he is the wisest mortal. And he's like, this doesn't make any sense. I don't understand why anyone would say I'm wise, because I really don't know anything. And so Socrates explains, once he receives this message through his friend from the Delphi oracle about him being the wisest person, he goes around trying to test it. And that's where we learn about how he came to practice this sort of way of philosophizing, which is through questions. So the Socratic method is this sort of method of philosophy that Socrates develops. The word we use for this is also elenchus. And sometimes we call it dialectics. But essentially, what it means is you're proceeding to investigate an idea through cross examination, which means someone provides an answer, you ask them questions, they provide another answer, you ask them more questions, and you go back and forth. And what this back and forth questioning method does is it reveals the way people think about an idea. Um, so we frequently have an opinion about something and we just think we're right. We haven't really investigated it very deeply. But by being asked questions, we start to realize, oh, what are the assumptions behind this idea? And sometimes we realize they're kind of weak. Or we might realize we hold two contradictory positions that you can't really reconcile with each other, which means we might be kind of confused about an idea. And sometimes we also see blind spots, places where what we think doesn't make sense at all. And so Socratic method demonstrates what you do not know. And people really, really did not like this, right? So Socrates explains himself going to all the people in Athens who are considered the wisest, the experts in politics, the experts in poetry, the experts in craftsmanship. And the word craft, techne, in ancient Greek, meant any variety of things that require knowledge. So a doctor was considered a craftsman. Someone who made chairs, a carpenter, would be considered a craftsman. Someone who bred horses would be considered a craftsman too. So anyone who has sort of knowledge, Socrates would ask them questions. And he would often reveal that they don't know what they claim to know. So we call this aporia, when someone is having a conversation and they're being questioned by Socrates, and they reach a point where they say, I don't know, Socrates. Um, this is what we call an aporia. It literally means no passage. A means no, and poria means passage. Um, we might call that an impasse. So this means that you've reached a certain recognition where there was something you really thought you knew, and now you realize you don't know it. So an aporia isn't just saying, oh, I don't know. It's this sort of moment where it feels like the rug has been pulled out from underneath you, because at one point you did think you know, and now the tables have turned and you realize you actually do not know. So frequently in a Socratic dialogue, this is because someone realizes they contradicted themselves, or there's some sort of flaw in the way that they're thinking, and they realize they're wrong for the first time, and it's a big moment. So aporia is not bad if we're thinking of a Socratic dialogue in relation to the allegory of the cave, right? We need to move away from the shadows on the wall. We need to move away from faulty, bad opinions about the world and go outside and see the light of day, see how things really are. And aporia helps us to realize that, right? So that first moment when someone turns away from the shadows and sees the fire and realizes those shadows are not reality, that's a moment of aporia. They realize the thing I thought I knew is in fact not the case. And there's this new thing, but I don't know what it is yet. So aporia is that moment of suspension where you don't know. You know that you're wrong, but you don't yet know how to get to the right answer. So this ends up being why Socrates is so wise. He solves the riddle that the oracle gives him. He's like, it can't be true at first, right? He thinks, this can't be true. I don't know anything. How can I be the wisest? And then he solves the riddle by discovering that he isn't like other people who claim to know things they do not know. So a lot of times people have no knowledge that they're ignorant. They think they know things, right? They think the shadows on the wall are the real thing. And so he's wiser to them, at least to this small degree, that he does not claim to know what he does not know. So Socratic wisdom is knowing that you do not know. And the reason why this is so rare is we often tend to have hubris or overconfidence. We're frequently just too confident that we know what we're talking about, right? You don't walk around the world thinking, oh, I don't know. I don't know. You usually walk around the world thinking you do know things and that you have a pretty firm grasp of reality. But the thing is, we are frequently wrong, and it takes a lot for us to recognize that. So when Socrates is going around questioning people, these are people who really firmly think they know what they're talking about. And it's his mode of questioning them, when they actually have to give an account of why they think what they do, that we see they don't know everything and they frequently do not really know what they're talking about instead. So this is why Socrates says he's so unpopular and why they want to kill him, right? He says, if you show people they're wrong, they're not going to like you. So he calls himself a gadfly. He says that the gods sent him to the city like a gadfly on a horse, right? So a gadfly is like a horsefly. It bites people or animals really, really hard, and it hurts, and it would wake you up. And so he's using this as a metaphor to describe himself as someone who is waking up other people, right? So a gadfly is someone who annoys other people with questions that force them to respond and act. And he is the first one to use this metaphor to say, I'm a gadfly. I am buzzing around and waking you up and getting you to realize that you're ignorant. But this is a term we still use today. So we still use the term gadfly, although today we frequently describe it, a gadfly, as someone who's fighting for social justice, someone who's specifically challenging the status quo. So Socrates says this is really necessary for him to do because Athens is like a lazy horse that just wants to stay asleep, and it needs someone to buzz and wake it up. So in this dialogue, which is more of a monologue because he's speaking before a court and giving a long speech, Socrates is really defending not just himself, he's also defending what philosophy is. And he says that philosophy means discussing virtue every day. He says this on page 41. Right? This is what it means to be a philosopher, is to have these philosophical conversations. What is he talking about? He says he's talking about virtue. So virtue comes from the Greek word arete. And in some ways, virtue is not the best translation. We might think of arete more as excellence or being the best that something can be. So for example, if I have like a pair of scissors and I want to say, well, what is the arete of my scissors? I have to think about the purpose of these scissors. They're for cutting. And so part of the virtue of the scissors would be that they're sharp enough to cut. That would be an example of an arete, or something that would make these scissors excellent scissors. Now, if you think about a human, what is the arete of a human? You would have to say, well, what is the purpose of a human life? What are we here for? What are we here to do? So when you're talking about virtue, you're talking about what does it mean to live well? How do I live a fulfilling life? How do I flourish in life and make the most of my life? So that's what he means when he says philosophers discuss virtue every day. And then the other thing he says is that the unexamined life is not worth living. So this is the other way he's describing philosophy, is that it is examining one's life. It's thinking about the beliefs that affect how you live. It's not just abstract or head in the sky, right? It's asking questions that fundamentally affect who you are and what you do with yourself. And then the last part of this dialogue is, in some ways, people are shaming Socrates for putting his life at risk to practice philosophy. They're saying, why would you do this? Look at you, you're in the courtroom, you're dangerous, your life is going to come to an end because of philosophy, just quit, right? So there is a point in this trial where Socrates could have agreed to stop practicing philosophy. He could have said, put me in exile, or I'll quit doing philosophy. And instead he said, no, I will never quit philosophy. I don't want to leave Athens. Athens is where my philosophical community is. This is where I have these conversations. You're going to have to kill me to get me to stop philosophizing. So he really does give up his life for philosophy. And he says that he should not be afraid of this. He says, you know, people die in battle and we do not consider them to be doing something wrong. So it's like he is posing himself as doing something that is good, and not just good, but it's so good it is worth risking his life. And he also thinks that we don't really know what death is, right? We don't know if it's just, he says, a change in location, or if it's the end of all things. But we have no reason to expect that it's a terrible thing. And so when we're fearing death, we're pretending as though we know something we do not. We're pretending to be wise when we're not. So Socrates really shows us that his philosophy is his life, and he's not willing to give it up. He would rather die than stop philosophizing. So if we put this all together, this is, the Apology really shows us what philosophy is, who Socrates is the philosopher, how he practices it, and why he thinks it's really important. So as you read, I want you to think about what philosophy is and how it's being presented.